Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to be?
It's the one riddle that seems almost impossible to solve. Look at any major city, regardless of political or economic system, and the chances are it's not solved a basic issue for its citizens: how to strike a balance between supply and demand for housing. And in that dilemma lies a real human rights problem, at least according to the UN's Special Rapporteur for Adequate Housing, Leilani Farha. She was appointed in 2014, and the picture she's painting of this difficult situation isn't pretty. Given how persistent and pervasive it is around the world, a natural question to ask is there any solution and any particular or easily identifiable cause? We discuss this real and complex question with Leilani Farha on Talk to Al Jazeera. Leilani Farha, Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. Thank you for talking to Al Jazeera. We'll have a discussion about the global housing and homelessness problem, but first let me ask you about that title, Special Rapporteur. Explain to us what that means, what you do, and who you report to.
Sure. I was appointed by the UN Human Rights Council, which is pretty much the highest human rights body within the UN system. And I am appointed as a kind of global watchdog, at least that's how the media presents me. And my job is to monitor and assess how people are doing with respect to their right to housing in countries around the world. So it's a global mandate, and I look at things like homelessness, the adequacy of housing, the affordability of housing, forced evictions, those sorts of things. My job is also to kind of develop the right to housing to some degree, to write thematic reports, to help states understand what does the right to housing actually mean and how can it be implemented in a practical way. I also try to hold states accountable to their human rights obligations. Not an easy task, but certainly a really important one in this day and age.
Let's start with the basics. You talk about the right to housing. Where is it written down that everyone has a right to housing?
Yeah, so it's in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example. Article 26, everyone has the right to an adequate standard of living, including adequate housing. It's in a
document that soon celebrates its 70th birthday.
That's right,
in a
right now.
couple of months' time.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. So, you know, that is the main articulation. And I like that articulation because it sits there amidst all of the human rights, you know, and that's the way I view housing. It has tentacles into every other human right, practically. Think about the right to life and security of the person. But it's in a whole host of treaties. The most recent treaty to come into being, the one on persons with disabilities, it includes the right to adequate housing. It's in an articulation of economic, social, and cultural rights, a treaty about those rights. It's articulated there. It's actually one of the most articulated economic and social rights out there. So there has been a lot of writing and activism on the right to housing.
The right to adequate housing, though, that's a difficult word, isn't it? What is adequate? Who decides what is adequate?
Yeah, so it's funny because it's so obvious what might be adequate housing. What we say is that under international human rights law, and there's a UN committee that has talked about this through what they call a general comment, that housing is not just about four walls and a roof. It is about four walls and a roof, but it's not just about that. It's about living in a place where you have peace, security, and most importantly, dignity. And once you start playing with the idea of dignity, well, you can imagine what that means. It means living in a place with proper sanitation and basic services, toilets, running water. It means living in a place that's close to employment so that you can actually generate an income for your family or household. It means living close to healthcare services, childcare services. It means having security of tenure, and that's a cornerstone of the right to housing. In other words, you should not be fearful that you're going to lose your home like that. Those are the basic tenants. It means living in a place without experiencing discrimination, having access to housing without discrimination. So adequacy is actually fairly well defined. And in this, right now, affordability is a key component of adequate housing. And the way affordability is defined is based on what a household income is. So housing has to be affordable to people based on their actual income, not based on what the market can bear.
You've defined it very clearly. Let's now talk about how many people in the world do not have that. Now, preparing to talk to you, have been trying to read all the statistics. You're an expert on this. I've been trying to get up to speed. It seems to me the last time a really big global survey was done was a long time ago, 2005, when they came up with figures of 100 million homeless worldwide and 1.6 billion people lacking adequate housing. That's some time ago, over a decade ago.
Yes.
Has the situation got worse or better?
Yes. I mean, I suspect the situation has only got worse. If I look at my daily reality and my email inbox, I can only say that there are so many troubling issues in the area of housing right now. So I think those figures are probably outdated and things have probably got worse. We do know, for example, that approximately 900 million people, that's a quarter of the world's population, are living in informal settlements. Informal settlements, slums. That is, without all of those elements of adequacy that I was talking about, often without basic services, certainly without security of tenure. So, I mean, it's a huge percentage of the world's population, right? This is a very, very urgent and serious matter. If you have whatever figures of homelessness and how you define homelessness, even if you just look at street homelessness, tell me a city you've been to where you haven't seen street homelessness, right?
You talk about these informal settlements, slums, shanty towns, that's
Yes.
how some call them. Of course, some of the people there see that as their community.
Absolutely.
And they don't actually want to move from those places, do they?
That's exactly right. And one of the things that I find fascinating about informal settlements is the dual nature. On the one hand, people are experiencing extreme violations of human rights in those informal settlements or slums, right? No toilets and no sanitation. I mean, the horror of that, we can all imagine. No showers, crumbling structures, fear of eviction all the time. So that's, on the one hand, the reality. On the other hand, I visited many informal settlements. The vibrancy in those places, the sense of community, the way they will, even though they don't have a paved road, they will name their streets. They will give each house a number. They will ensure there's a community center where people can meet and talk and discuss. There is a vibrancy there, and people do want to remain in their homes, of course. Some people have lived in informal settlements for decades and generations. So of course they don't want to leave, and in fact, under international human rights law, that's the standard. Upgrading should happen in an in situ, or as we say, on-site way. In other words, don't remove people from their homes unless there is absolutely no other option.
I've been looking at some of the figures, or trying to find some of the figures for some of the key countries, and obviously the problem is going to be worst in the places where there are more people, particularly more people living in urban areas. And it's difficult to get the real figures. Nigeria, I've seen an estimate of 24.4 homeless people. Estimates in India, an official figure of 1.77 million, but then an estimate of 78 million. The figures vary widely, even here where we are right now. We're in New York, in the US. Official figures much smaller, but there are estimates of up to 3.5 million homeless. Do you believe this problem is seriously underreported? And if so, why?
You can decide that a homeless population is people living rough on the streets. And then you're going to get one figure. You're going to go around and do a count on a single night. How many people do you count on your streets? That's going to be a small figure. You could then say, no, my definition is on the streets and in shelters. So then you're going to get a slightly bigger figure. But what about all of those people who are couch surfing, living with family, friends, relatives, etc., because they have no other place to go? That's a population that is almost impossible to measure. We know that in every country that there is that population out there. We know that. And so the estimates are going to vary widely based on definition. I don't think that homelessness has been viewed as the human rights issue that it is, the I don't think it's been given the sort of urgency of political will, of social policy that it deserves. And so I think that's also part of the problem.
Let's talk about the life of someone who is homeless in the wider definition, whether it's in an informal settlement or actually living on the streets. How does it affect someone's life, not just not having somewhere to live? In what other ways does it affect them? For example, their health.
Oh, this is a population that is deeply traumatized. You can imagine a day on the street. It would be completely traumatizing for us in light of how we're positioned in life. Imagine a week on the streets. Imagine a year. Imagine 5 years. It is a completely traumatizing experience. And what we find is that that experience can actually trigger psychosocial disability. People are always like, oh, the people who are homeless, they're all crazy, they all have psychological problems. Many people who hit the streets are completely of sound mind. It's the trauma of being on the street that can trigger psychosocial disability. The trauma of living on the street is what often leads people to do things like drugs, right? It's to numb the experience. I've talked to many people in the United States in particular. I was out in California and just saw some harrowing situations. People with gainful employment, working in hospitals, working in animation studios, living on the streets, and telling me that the trauma of that has led them to undertake activities they never thought that they would be doing.
You mentioned life expectancy. One figure I saw came from the UK, from the National Health Service in the UK. The average homeless person has a life expectancy of 47 years. Now, if you go back to the wider population in the UK, you'd have to go back about 100 years for that to be the average life expectancy. This is shameful, isn't it?
I think it's shameful. And you gave figures of homeless rates in different countries, and you said, well, of course in the bigger countries there's going to be more people who are homeless. But the way in which we deal with sort of an analysis of homelessness is not so much based on population size and ratio, but we look at the wealth and resources of a country. And then we look at housing and inadequate housing and homelessness. Because of course there should be a correlation. Wealthy nation, largest GDP in the world, you might expect to see less homelessness per capita, etc., or no homelessness. But that's not what we're seeing. If you look at North America, if you look at Europe, what are we seeing? Rising rates of homelessness in the richest countries in the world. That, to me, is where we get into extremely shameful territory. Extremely shameful. Why is that? How is it acceptable that, GDPs are increasing all the time, hopefully, and homelessness is rising all the time?
So is the main reason that cities, as they grow, as urbanization takes place, have become unaffordable for most people?
One of the things is this very new phenomenon we've seen since about 2008, that very special year where we mark the global financial crisis. Housing has changed. Housing has become basically the hottest commodity around. And at the same time, housing is supposed to be a human right. And so what we have is uber investment in housing as a commodity, as a place to park capital and grow wealth. And that has changed the way in which housing operates. It means, if you think about it, if you have investors, private equity firms, vulture funds, buying up housing, who is their principal concern? It's their investor. And if they're using housing to satisfy their investor interests, what do they have to do with that housing if it's rental housing? It's obvious. They have to increase the rents.
So what do governments do about the problem of homelessness? Because some are only dealing with that part of the problem.
Yes.
Hungary, for example, has come up with a new law. It's made homelessness effectively a crime. It's banned for you to live on the streets. They say people should go to emergency shelters. Is that going to help?
A policy like that, I think it's cruel. And I think it's completely misguided, and obviously it's out of step with international human rights and human rights obligations. It's out of step with the Sustainable Development Goals. There are places that are doing some good works in the area of homelessness. If you
This
look,
is the housing first idea, is it?
It is, which actually sits nicely within a human rights framework. The idea of housing first, Finland is where the model was first developed, and it's where it is most successful. Finland and Norway are the only places in Europe where we haven't seen an increase in homelessness in the last year. And the housing first model is just that. You say, we will provide this population with housing first, and then we will provide all of the services and supports that those households need in order to make a go of things. And that's not time delimited, and that's where the success lies in Finland, for example. So in other words, it's not, oh, we'll throw services and supports at you for 12 months and then, hey, pull up your socks and make your own way. It is services and supports until that household really can be autonomous and survive and thrive. So that is a model that is working on the homelessness front. But that doesn't address affordability issues and these bigger macro things that are happening that I've touched on.
You've mentioned your visits. You've mentioned your very recent visit to Egypt, where you were allowed to go in. Many other human rights defenders have not been allowed to visit Egypt. The government there is trying to make efforts to provide new housing. Are you concerned, though, that they are also trying to move populations away from the areas where they have their livelihood?
Yeah, my trip to Egypt is very fresh. I just got back. I think that the government is making a concerted effort to deal with some of their housing issues. They've prioritized people living in what they call life-threatening situations. So, you know, too close to a railway line, underneath power lines, that kind of thing, underneath rocks that could fall. And I think that that's really important. Obviously, we want to save lives. I am a little bit concerned about the model in Egypt because it's not people-centered, and a human rights approach to dealing with informality or dealing with inadequate housing, and I should say 40% of the population in Egypt is living in informal housing, or what people call slums. The human rights approach should be human-centered. You should really ensure that the population is part of the process every step of the way. It's an understanding that communities actually have knowledge, expertise about their own fate and their own futures and their own communities. And you have to empower those communities, provide them with the resources to come up with their own plans.
Another one recently, I think, worth raising is Kibera in Nairobi,
Oh, yes.
where there was an informal settlement, shanty town, slum, whatever you want to call it. To build a new road, they got rid of the homes of some 30,000 people. What was interesting there, I think, I don't know whether you saw the photo that was taken by a Reuters photographer, there while they're demolishing the homes in that shanty town, next door there's the green of a golf course. And there are golfers watching the destruction of these homes. It really sums up, doesn't it, the inequality that's at the centre of all of this.
The Kibera situation is also deeply alarming to me. And again, I spoke out about that situation, 30,000 people facing homelessness. That's the reality, completely contrary to international human rights law and Kenya's own constitution, which protects the right to housing and has provisions around forced evictions. As I said, the standard for these situations is that, forced eviction is considered a gross violation of human rights. No community should be evicted unless there is absolutely no viable alternative. I've seen situations in Thailand where, in Bangkok, where the government wanted to build an off-ramp from a highway right into a community, an informal settlement, and the community rallied and managed to figure out a way that that off-ramp could in fact come down and the community could remain intact. These things are possible. I may not want to live underneath a ramp, but that community wanted to stay, and that was possible in Bangkok. Surely there was another way in Kibera. It's the largest informal settlement in Nairobi. It's mind-boggling to me. I think the understanding of home has been lost. I think people are viewed as dispensable. I think, as you say, it's this inequality. Some people's lives matter, and some don't seem to.
But how do you stop what has become all over the world. I mean, it's a result of urbanization, globalization, and speculation. How do you stop this trend? Because it's there. Rich investors look and they go, where am I going to put my money today? Stocks, bonds, am I going to put it in gold? Oh no, the safest bet is to buy property, even if I don't want to live in it.
Yep. It is absolutely a huge problem. And I love that you mentioned, should I put my money in gold versus housing? And I can tell you everyone is going to housing and not gold. Residential real estate is now valued at $163 trillion. Which, I mean, I can't even get my head around. I'm not a numbers person. I can't get my head around that. $163 trillion is the value of residential real estate. If you take the value of all gold that has been mined, $7 trillion, right? So people are going for residential real estate for sure. How do you curb that? That is the question of the day. I think that some governments are doing some interesting things around this. If you take Singapore, they have an 18% tax on foreign-owned property. So that's it's using a tax system to sort of keep that at bay a little bit, or at least keep it in check. Things like that can happen. You have a law in Catalonia where they're trying to make it such that no mortgage foreclosure should result in eviction, that would be eviction into homelessness, that would be illegal. So there are these small attempts at curbing this. What do I think?
They're small attempts, though. Look at the way the world is run.
Yes.
Even look at who's running the world right now. The United States of America is being run by a property developer.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that too, because that's not often talked about. And what does that mean? And when President Trump originally had that advisory group, I mean, who did he have in that advisory group? The CEO of Blackstone, the largest private equity firm that is buying up properties, real estate, residential real estate around the world, and really creating unaffordability everywhere they go. Almost like a price-fixing situation, right?
You mentioned Blackstone. What about reaching out to companies like that to see if they can help solve the problem that perhaps they're creating?
Yeah. Well, yes, I have actually reached out to Blackstone and have tried to meet with them, because I actually see them and my position as rapporteur as somehow related. They are becoming, they're one of the third largest landlord in New York, largest landlord in the United States. They own, I think, something like 300,000 units worldwide, right? They're a major player in the housing sector. I'm a housing person on the global scale. We should be talking. It hasn't happened yet, and I would really welcome that conversation, because I'm not sure that they're aware of all of these human rights standards. I don't think it's in their mindset. It's not in their business model, that's for sure. But could it be? I'm open. I mean, I'm open to having that conversation.
You mentioned that goal. These are the goals the UN set to improve the world by 2030. Let me just remind you what it says. By 2030, ensure access for all to adequate, safe and affordable housing and basic services, and upgrade slums. Everything you've told me is that on that goal, other ones may be going well, everything is going backwards. We're not going to reach that goal in 12 years, are we?
Look, we have to strive to reach that goal in 12 years. States have that obligation. They've made that commitment. I think if states and cities took it seriously and decided to adopt human rights-based housing strategies, and I've written a report about that and what that might look like, I think that huge strides could be taken. That's what I think. That's my ambition, is to see states take this very seriously and actually adopt strategies that focus on the most vulnerable, that change the way decision making is made, that ensure accountability of governments to the people, that ensure equality, those sorts of things, big principles. If that was guiding housing policy, maybe we would inch toward that 2030 deadline and that commitment.
Leilani Farha, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you.